to those of you who don't know him. A lot of people in the AA know David very well because although he formally teaches in communications and sometimes in some other parts of the school, he also quite often arranges for talks and investigations of bits of London which a whole range of other students get involved in. David has a tremendous knowledge of the city and a reading of the way in which London works, which is extremely interesting. However, for this series of lectures, he's doing something very different. He's addressing the question of looking at paintings and from the point of view of an artist, really beginning to investigate what we mean by looking. Something that's tremendously important in the work of architects as well, but we often shortcut looking at things because we're so busy trying to solve other problems. It is very important to hear from the point of view of an artist about how one not only looks at things, but actually looks at paintings, things made by artists with a certain content to them. Many of you will know David already. You may not know of the sort of wide range of things that he is involved in. Much of his work is related to different architectural space. Last year he made a temporary installation in the Soane Museum. Many of you will know that extraordinary building. He has been the visual artist involved with the dance work of Siobhan Davis, who I'm sure many of you will have come across, and her dance company. Last year, developing visual work to go with the dance, and that's currently being redesigned and redeveloped for a new setting that will be shown later this year. And last week, another very different sort of project based in Reading, taking a whole street and taking the upper levels of a shopping street and installing a very large work using glass, stained glass, to interpret a different way of reading the upper parts of the street. So you can see an extraordinary diverse range of work and of using the artistic engagement, often directly with spatial and architectural questions. Formerly, David's also been engaged as an artist in residence. It's always a term that I find rather uncomfortable, an artist in residence. It sort of conjures up strange images of an artist in a little hut somewhere. But as you know, many distinguished institutions use the concept of an artist in residence to bring into their institution someone who will add to and think rather differently than the main faculty. Amongst other places, David's been artist in residence at King's College in Cambridge and at Harvard in the States. So a different way in which his work has been very valuable to a whole range of different students. I won't say anything about looking at paintings, because that's what David's going to talk about, but I'm sure we're going to find it an extremely interesting beginning of a 6-part series of discussions. And at the end of the lecture, I'm sure we'll be able to open up some conversation based on what David says. So, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. Hello. Thank you all for coming. I'm David Ward, and part of what I want to talk about today is going to begin with something rather anecdotal, but the intention in the series is to talk about looking at painting. And I trained as a painter, and I worked as a painter for many years, although what Hugo's just described sounds quite distant perhaps from the practice of painting. It's my feeling that certainly in my case, that having begun a sort of principal sense of visual awareness through painting, that it is astonishingly persistent as a kind of influence on the way I see. to that end, I'm not going to give a series of talks about looking at painting which is intended to be in any sense art historical or chronological. And it doesn't attempt to embrace a comprehensive array of painterly genres. Rather, it is driven by an attempt on my part to understand again, a certain persistence, and that is the persistence of a small number of works that have stayed with me and seem to convey a certain sort of resilience in my experience, in that I can't seem to shake them off, and I continue to derive not only intense pleasure from them, but also extreme curiosity continues to be aroused by them. And to begin this, I decided that I would actually impose a certain sort of biographical chronology on it all by reflecting on a work that I've known since my student days. In 1972, I was a painting student at Winchester School of Art, and during those years, I received permission to actually continue my studies, not in the School of Art itself, but for about a year and a half, I was working in Cornwall, in the west of England. And in December of 1972, that's just a few months over some 32 years ago, a postcard arrived in my letterbox. And it was a postcard of a painting which I had never seen before. And this is it. This is the postcard, the one that arrived, the very one. And in the 32 years since it arrived, it's traveled a very great deal with me. It made its first journey from Edinburgh, where a friend of mine who was studying music at university had posted it. So its first journey was from Edinburgh to St Ives. It went back with me from St Ives to Winchester School of Art. It moved to London with me later at the end of 1973. And since then it's crossed the Atlantic a couple of times. It's spent about a year and a half in Glasgow, about a year pinned to a wall in Durham, and currently it's here in the AA, and part of what I want to talk about is looking at the postcards, so I think we should keep it in sight slightly next to this kind of monochrome, temporary monochrome on the screen. It was quite a long time before I actually saw the painting. And in the space in between, I even made pieces of work of my own with the image before I'd even seen the painting. It was quite a shock for me when I actually saw the painting, because it was a different scale to the one that I'd expected. But before we look at anything to do with that, I'm going to show us an image, a scan of the postcard. That's a scan of this postcard, and you can see it's sort of had a bit of an experience over the years. It's got drawing pinholes and it's slightly creased. It's stained in certain lights, a kind of varnish. I can't remember where that came from, but there's a kind of varnishy drip on it. And it's spent most of its time on studio walls and propped on the shelves of studios. Now the painting, I had anticipated somehow being a full-length portrait painting, a full-scale, full-length portrait painting. And so when I first went to see it, which was very close to closing time in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, I didn't get to the gallery until about 10 minutes before it was due to close on a very rainy afternoon. And ran through the galleries, paced quickly through the galleries, asking every visible attendant, where's the skater? And of course, it wasn't the ubiquitous image today that then in 1972 that it is today. But, oh yes, it's over there, they said, down the stairs, around the corner. And when I rounded the corner and saw the painting on the wall, I actually went, oh, like I literally did do that. Because it wasn't a full-scale, full-length portrait painting at all. I've got a couple of slides here. Right. I don't know if you can all see those slides. If you can't, I recommend you move over to your right in order to see them, because they say something about, or I'm trying to say something about them. These two slides are both supplied, they're both images from the National Gallery of Scotland. The colour slide on the left is the slide you would buy if you went to the National Gallery of Scotland shop to buy a picture of the painting, a slide of the painting. The negative, black and white image was made by me from an archival, a curatorial archival conservation photograph of the painting that was posted to me by the National Gallery of Scotland. And the black and white image is almost exactly the size of the actual painting. So the first thing I think to acknowledge in my attempt to talk about paintings is that on one of these afternoons will we be able to actually address the paintings. We're only able to address images of the paintings. So why was I so surprised in Edinburgh when I saw the painting for the first time, when I thought I knew it so well? You know, if somebody had stopped me on the street and said, you know, you're going to see this painting, I would have said, well, I'm so familiar with it. I think I'd known it for something like 12 years since the postcard arrived. I'd made projected wall-based works with it and one performance work with it in the years in between. And of course, the reason I was so surprised was that I was familiar with the image of the painting and not the painting itself. I'm going to try and keep these slides on the left going throughout the next sort of half an hour. It's possible they will spontaneously burst into flame, but Land is going to keep an eye on them. And if anybody sees any disturbing signs of conflagration, shout out. But we're going to see if they can make it through to the end. Okay, now there are a lot of images to look at. This is a scan of the postcard again, and the postcard, which is now available from the National Gallery of Scotland shop. Something we have to remember when we're looking and examining images of paintings rather than the paintings themselves is the discrepancies, the extraordinary differences between the reproductions of works. And not only does the contemporary postcard have a somewhat closer resemblance to the colours and tonalities of the actual painting, but curiously, it's departed from the proper proportion of the painting, and a significant slice has been taken off the right-hand edge of the work. So the skater's relocated much closer to the right-hand edge of the painting. And I fancy there's a slight sort of narrowing of it here too. Although the earlier postcard isn't exactly the right proportion, it's much closer. It's quite a significant shift. So we bear all these things in mind while we're thinking about the picture. And something like 1986, so it was 1972, it was over 10, 12, 14 years after the postcard arrived, this image arrived through the post. It's the frontispiece of a small book published in the 1930s of competition figure skating instructions. And I assume that this is Mr. Iglesias himself performing a forward inward spiral in the frontispiece photograph. This was sent to me by the late Stuart Morgan, an excellent art critic who I recommend you read if you're not aware of him. There are published editions of his collected writings. I'd been talking to Stuart about skating, and he'd been trying to encourage me to make a skating film. And to my surprise, a couple of weeks later, this early book arrived, and I was startled to see that the frontispiece actually was the skater seeming to be zooming along in a very similar position to the Reverend Robert Walker in Henry Raeburn's famous painting. What you might just be able to see, given the vagaries of picture scanning, is that, of course, this skater isn't moving at all. He's posing in a photographic studio. And we can just see the trace of what's enabling him to stand up. I don't know if you can see this from where you are, but there's a shape here. Like that. And there's another little vertical column up there to the right-hand side of the body. It's, if you look at the frontispiece photograph yourself, you can see it's a fantastically badly retouched picture in which a wooden prop, which is enabling him to do this, has been touched out to give the impression that he's in an open space. And I have very little doubt that the Reverend Robert Walker was similarly, or somebody standing in for him, was similarly supported in Raeburn's studio in Edinburgh in the late 1890s, when this painting was completed. The arm position, I discovered, is known as the conventional travelling position. And it recurs throughout the sort of iconography of representations of skaters. These two, of course, are holding each other up. They're not skating anywhere. But this is typical of the photographic representation of skaters, as far as I'm able to follow it, in which the notion of the carefree and the joyful are largely combined. These two, I think, are skating. And this remarkable photograph is of the great opera singer Pavlova, who is photographed skating from above on this fantastic etched floor. And there's no doubt that Pavlova is skating. I think there's quite a difference between the dynamics of images like these, in which the camera's rendition of the movement of a garment, for instance, is really quite different, I think. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. In which the photograph's grasp of the flow of a garment, for instance, is completely different to this extraordinary rectangular kind of curved lozenge of Reverend Robert Walker's frock coat. And a certain flamboyance, I think, characterizes the representation of skating, both in painting and photography. This is a precedent to Raeburn. It's a work which was painted a few years earlier and caused a bit of a sensation, I gather, when it was shown at the Royal Academy. It's not unlikely that Raeburn would have seen it. It's by Gilbert Stuart, and it was painted in 1782. And the Raeburn is uncertain, but it's probably 1790s. What we can just about make out in this Gilbert Stuart painting, however, is still this, the notion of the raised foot, of the figure moving on one foot. And that puts us in touch with a whole other iconography of the often individual figure seeming to pass across the rectangle of the frame of the painting. This is a Manet painting of 1862, the next century, Mademoiselle V. This is a portrait of a woman dressed as an espada, which is, I think, a more proper term for a matador at the point at which the bull is about to be killed. Mademoiselle V was directly derived by Manet from a classical precedent, which is a very persistent one indeed. This is the particular print that Manet was aware of from 16th century engraving of Raimondi, and perhaps today the most famous example of this particular notion of the one foot poised as if in the process of taking a step is this small relief known as Gradiva, which adorns Freud's study. And amongst other things, contemporary artists have made use of the iconography of this particular notion of a sustained moment of a continuous about to proceed, the process of proceeding. I'm quite interested in this myself, and have noted it from time to time in other works that interest me, not only in the subject, the medium of painting. This is a photograph I made myself during a study of Rodin's The Age of Bronze. This particular cast is in Leeds City Art Galleries, where I both wrote a speculative text and produced a small portfolio of photographs of the sculpture that was published by the Henry Institute there. And the Age of Bronze is much discussed in terms of what exactly this figure is doing, if it's in the process of rising, if it's in the process of falling. And the eloquence of that ambiguity is really held in this slightly raised heel. So yes, I'm suggesting that there is a sort of association or affiliation in this iconography, classical at least in its origins, of a figure in the process of passing across a picture plane that we are at right angles to. This is another Rodin sculpture, which I only saw last year for the first time in this particular site. This is in Scotland, and this is a slightly later sculpture to the Age of Bronze known as John the Baptist, or sometimes more prosaically and possibly better as the Walking Man. But quite a different sort of resonance here, I would suggest, with both these characteristically Rodin-esque enlarged feet cemented very firmly to the ground plane. It's like a figure stressed rather than a figure in the process of moving or passing. This is a very poor scan, I'm afraid, of an absolutely fantastic painting, a very late Titian, normally resident, usually resident at the National Gallery here in London. It's a very late painting, The Death of Actaeon, in which two forms of recurring iconography, actually, we might get to this, but we might not, occur. One is this movement, the body set on one foot with this indication of a swift passage, but suspended, with this imagery of the bow. Interestingly enough, and this is verging on a sort of art historical thing, I came across these two tiny little reproductions of very early Raeburn paintings, one of which the whereabouts is no longer known of, one of them. But they're two early studies. He went to Rome, as many British painters did. They seem to combine two things, actually. One is the notion of a certain sort of progress, the position of the folded arms, and then this odd kind of looking back at a foot. I mean, together, if you sort of combine the upper half of one on the lower half of the other, are the ingredients for Robert Walker's travelling position. Now this investigations into this kind of moment, this notion of examining the passage of a body through space across a plane which is at right angles to the viewer, is one of the first substantial photographic preoccupations. And, you know, one hardly needs to mention that Muybridge is key in the evidence of that interest, of the recognition of the camera as a mechanism that could investigate the body's actual positioning sequentially across that picture plane at 90 degrees to the point of view of the viewer. And this particular set of a woman walking down steps provides a very clear difference, I think, between Muybridge and his very near contemporary Etienne Jules Marais in his investigation of human locomotion. This is a particularly well-known sequential image of Marais in which a figure standing initially on the chair steps down to the ground and is subject to a series of multiple exposures on the same negative. The figure is dressed in black, wearing just white points on every hinge of the body, at the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder, the hip, the knee, the ankle, and so on, and the head, with white strings connecting those points together. So whereas Muybridge was always wedded to the notion of a sequence of individual photographic images, one after the other, Marais superimposed them on top of each other, but with this rather abstracting effect of reducing the body simply to hinge points and limb lines. In fact, Marais was really driven by experiencing a magic lantern show of Muybridge's in Paris in the 1880s. This rather iconic image of Marcel Duchamp from 1912 is nude descending a staircase, was acknowledged by Duchamp as having been particularly stimulated by the work of Marais. And I find it quite interesting in a late interview where Duchamp is asked by the interviewer, well, your nude descending a staircase must have been stimulated greatly by the experience of cinema. He says, well, cinema, yes, but really it was Marais. And in one of those serendipitous things that occur from time to time, there is an obituary in today's Guardian for an artist who was fantastically well known when I was a student, called Soto, a Venezuelan artist who spent much of his life living in Paris. But Soto was famous in the late 60s and early 70s as what was known as a kinetic artist. And in the obituary today, there is a quote from Soto in which he really layers Duchamp and Muybridge over the top of each other, saying that in a sense they're the same thing. Now, we can argue that or not, but I think what I'm trying to do in this sequence of images is take us into a kind of kinetic realm, into an awareness of a certain preoccupation with an attempt to actually represent movement, which I think actually it's important for me to make my own position clear, I think is really quite different from the effect of the Raeburn painting of the skater. I'm not convinced that Raeburn's Robert Walker skating conveys movement at all, but we'll come into this a little further. This slightly melancholy and very beautiful photograph is an extremely early photograph of Maret's. It's simply known as, I think it's something like a man in white against a large black ground. But once again, the moment that is chosen is this sort of moment of passage, the slightly raised foot. Now, just to digress for 10 seconds to clarify a little bit some of my own responses to this work, the making of this image as a negative is something that is a work that I made in 1991. And in 1992, this was one manifestation of it in a solo performance work that I made in Vienna. If you, just to grasp the scale of it, those are my feet and those are my legs, so I'm about that tall. And this is a time-lapse photograph of me moving then along the length of the gallery with a little head torch on, and the head torch is shining on the ground and producing a disk of light. So these are time-lapse photographs in which the point of light is translated into a continuous line. It was a bit of a skate for me. And in that notion of an interior space, apologies for this rather poor scan of an image by Hogarth, one of two images that accompany his analysis of beauty essays. If you look up into the top left-hand corner, you can see two rectangles, and vaguely, I think you would agree, you can see a sort of linear figure in each of them, and what they are dance notations for duets, in which the movement of each performer is represented as an instruction of a line inscribed across the floor. And of course, within the analysis of beauty, Hogarth argues for what he called the supremacy of the serpentine line as a fundamental linear aesthetic. Very similar, those little diagrams, to these, which are skating diagrams from the little book that I mentioned to you. Now, these concentrations on the horizontal plane now, in a sense thinking about the location of the figure and the orientation of the body at right angles to our point of view, has to then be taken into thinking about the relationship of that represented body to a horizontal plane. And the horizontal plane, of course, could hardly be more emphatically or clearly expressed than in a sheet of ice. This is a detail of the Raeburn, the skate in contact with the ice. And what we see is very interestingly achieved. There are two layers of paint in the lower part, the lower area of the picture. One of them allowed to dry, and then the second grey scratched into, probably with the handle end of a very fine brush, scratched through to the slightly darker layer underneath. And then these little areas, of course, are additional painting. But the fact is that for such a small work, in fact, you you can see it far more clearly in a monochrome picture of the work. The work is literally physically scratched. And even for a painter like Raeburn, who is noted for the bravura directness of his painting, of his brush work, there's a sort of viscerality to this scratching of the representation of the horizontal plane, which, of course, is completely consistent with the action of a skate on ice, which is actually quite a sort of nerve-wracking thing to experience. I don't know how many of you have skated. I've only tried it rather unsuccessfully once, but the engagement of the skate on the ice, as you probably will know, is an intensely physical thing. This isn't a badly skated on sheet of ice at all. This is a plaster horizontal plane, usually known as tracing floors. There are only a couple of known examples of these in Britain, one in Wells Cathedral and one in York Minster. The tracing floors were rooms within the construction of both Wells Cathedral and York Minster, rooms about a quarter of the floor area of the room we're standing in now, in which a sort of, what's the word in plastering terms? A sort of scrim or whatever of plaster was laid down, which was scratched into by the stonemasons, who produced full-sized templates of the stonework to be produced and raised up vertically around this horizontal floor. So they are rather beautiful in my feelings, recollections of part of the structure that now surrounds them. They're like drawing boards, huge full-scale drawing boards. This is a detail of the head, of course. And it reveals another aspect of Raeburn's method, which was sometimes the extremely physical relocation of parts of the painting. Occasionally, his portraits were relocated on the stretcher by turning them through, up to even 8 or 10 degrees of relocating the figure in relation to the regularity of the rectangle of the painting. And clearly, some later thought went into the location of the hat, at least the hat. This is possibly the last painting that Raeburn worked on. It's unfinished, as you can see. But the reason that I wanted to include it is to demonstrate that Raeburn's consistent method of painting was completely direct. There is no underdrawing. There's not even any blocking in of tonalities and colour ranges. There is what I think something that exists in the imaginations of many people who don't paint, which is that paintings begin as a sort of point somewhere in the middle and spread out. And I think Raeburn's method was actually very close to that. It was a question of the eye to the subject and the eye to the plane and the painting. It's an intensely direct observational painting. And the virtuosity, really, of his painting, I think, is even more striking when you realize that it has that directness about it. And in this spreading out from a point across the flat surface of the rectangle of the painting, relating this back to the scratching, the visceral scratching of the scarred ice, I think is another important dimension to introduce at the beginning about this response to paintings. It seems to me the materiality of the spreading out of this stuff, this in oil paints, extremely greasy, fluid colour across the surface, has very powerful associations with the body and with the notion of skin. And this rather, I still find, very startling image, which comes from the medium of cinema, perhaps enables us to touch a little more on that. This is the opening frame of a film work by Samuel Beckett made during the mid-1960s, called Film, in which the principal performer is an extremely elderly Buster Keaton. And seconds after this surprising image appears on the screen, there is a kind of shimmer to this folded surface and a flicker, and behind it is Buster Keaton's eye. This is Buster Keaton's eyelid. In the French, which was, of course, the principal language that Beckett was writing in at the time, film, the title of the work, would probably translate as pellicule. And those of you who have a better grasp of French than me, I hope, would agree that pellicule carries with it a wider set of associations that include bodily skin associations, as well as including a term appropriate for the description of film, of the celluloid film itself, but also of film. So I'm tempted to suggest that Beckett was likely to have been aware of that association of the notion of film itself being established principally by an image of a fold of skin over the human eye. I wouldn't want to overdo this body association with the skin of paint, but it's certainly appropriate in the work of some artists. We may touch on it again. Coming close to the end of the sequence of images now, this is a photograph of a researcher examining the paths of electronically charged particles from subatomic particle imaging. This is a very large reproduction of an extremely tiny Rembrandt etching, in partly dry point and partly etched, of a skater from 1639. Of course, bearing a complete resemblance in its pose to Raeburn's painting, but very beautifully achieved, I think, in the notion of the fact that the image is achieved through scratching the surface. But the final reminder that I have, really, in terms of 20th century art practice to the precedent of the Raeburn painting, is this very famous photo montage made by Yves Klein with the photographer Harry Shunk in 1960, Leap into the Void. I wrote a few lines about this image for a Hayward Gallery exhibition of Yves Klein some years ago, in which I arrived at I suddenly was reminded of something I learned at school. When I was a schoolboy, and shipbuilding was still a significant manufacturing industry in Britain, and ships were still being built with rivets, by hand beating rivets together to clamp the plates of the hulls of ships together. I remember being told that it was done like this, that the riveters down on the floor of the shipyard would heat these huge rivets up in coke fires until they were red hot. And then gripping them with tongs, they would swing it upwards and throw the rivet vertically up the side of the ship being built. And up on the scaffolding, the riveters waiting would catch the red-hot rivet in a metal cup. And from there, tongs would insert it into the hole between the two plates, and men with great mallets would hammer the rivet together. And the skill of this wasn't just catching the rivet, it was also in the throwing of the rivet, so that it would reach a point of stasis just where the riveter was waiting to catch it. So there's this, the point at which an object is no longer going up and it's no longer going down. It's a moment of complete staticness. And it occurred to me that that's what Yves Klein's body feels like to me. It's neither in the process of still ascending and it's neither in the process of beginning to fall. And of course, it doesn't diminish the magic or the drama of the photograph to know that Klein didn't throw himself off the pediment, that it is a montaged image. And if you see a very good print of the original, it's completely clear that you can see that. I want to return just to a little bit of vocabulary in a moment to round off. But before doing that, I just will take this moment to hint at next week's talk. Next week, I'm going to concentrate on one work by the contemporary Canadian artist Jeff Wall. And this is a horizontal backlit photographic light box called Restoration. The subject relates to painting in that the subject, or the apparent subject of Wall's piece, is a 360-degree painted panorama in Switzerland that was made to memorialize the first action of the International Red Cross that had only just been founded in Switzerland. It was right towards the close of the Franco-Prussian War. The Red Cross administered aid for the first time to a foreign power when a large part of the French army retreated into Switzerland. This is recorded in a still existing and open panorama in Switzerland, and it appears to be the subject of Jeff Wall's work. Jeff Wall, as you may know, works a great deal with the digital modification of images in a completely seamless way. And there is, if I need to try to find links, there is some sort of intended connection between Yves Klein's immediate cut montage, Jeff Wall's digital manipulation, pixelated manipulation of images, and Jeff Wall's relationship, the relationships Wall suggests between the photographic and the realm of painting. But just to end, I decided to pursue a bit of vocabulary around this notion of skate. I wasn't sure in the end, or at least where I am now, whether I felt that that the Raeburn painting represented somebody in the act of skating. And if I felt that, then what did I think they might be doing? Well, I thought perhaps they're gliding. Gliding is an interesting term, I thought. It's one of its principal qualities in terms of its definition is that no engine is involved. A great deal of it's pointed out that a glide particularly refers to something that isn't driven by a mechanism, by an engine. It implies a certain sort of ease. That effortlessness, I think, is part of what holds me about the Raeburn painting. But there's also a crossing and a certain notion of passing. And I think at the moment where I feel closest to it is to do with the painting involving the experience of transit, of a kind of suspended transit. And I don't know if you recall, but last year we were in a position to observe the rare, extremely rare occurrence of the planet of Venus passing across the face of the sun. And in astronomical terms, this is known as a transit. Venus transit is that rare occurrence of the small point of Venus being visible against the luminous disk of the sun. It's an incredibly slow process. And perhaps the persistence of the Raeburn painting for me is through the achievement of a complete stilling of that process of transit. All paintings, you could say, are still, and paintings are not unique in terms of images that are still images. But within painting, I think, there is an occasional occurrence in which not only is the painting physically still, but the effect of the painting on the viewer, and I can only speak for myself in this, is to be stilled. I am stilled by the still painting. And that should emerge out of the apparent representation of a figure passing at a certain speed, I think is a phenomenon. It combines with an especially extraordinary formal resolution, I think. The association I had mostly is a sort of lapidarian association of something being cut, of something being inlaid. The extreme definition of the extraordinary silhouette and its inlaidness, I think, has strong associations, especially with this the physical nature of the surface itself, as lapidarian, as something inlaid or carved, or something of a certain sort of stature that for it to be carved or engraved becomes a possibility. That, I think, adds to its physicality. And there may be one other appeal of a contemporary nature here. I remembered when I was trying to gather some thoughts together to talk about this work, that some time ago, I haven't tried too much to contextualize or locate these responses outside of other images, but over the years I have occasionally located them in a certain sort of loosely grasped philosophical sense. One such was a remark that Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher who, as you know, died late last year, made in his catalogue introduction for an exhibition that he curated at the Louvre in the 1980s. He chose the subject of blindness and selected works from the Louvre collection around that particular topic. And in the introduction, I was trying to recall this. I can't recall it exactly, but he talked about a blind person being asked to talk about their responses to two artworks, and one of them was a landscape drawing, and the other was an object of sculpture. And to the surprise of the interviewer, this particular person said that they found touching the landscape drawing a more extraordinary experience than touching the tactile surface of the object, which I think was a portrait head. I can't remember exactly. And investigating this, the subject of the interview said that they found the drawing so extraordinary because they knew that it represented an extremely deep receding space. And the physicality of its flatness with the awareness, even though not sighted awareness, aroused an intense response, more intense than the physical object. So I have that in mind in talking about this representation of the horizontal plane in relation to the vertical plane of the painting. The second, which is maybe a little more contemporary in its topicality at least, appeared in the beginning of a short essay by Deleuze in a publication that MIT used to do called Zone. And the title of the essay, I think, was Mediators. And Deleuze was talking about movement and the impulse of movement. And he made a comparison between what energizes the body, what moves the body in what you might call the classical Olympian sports. You know, the sprint, the throwing of the javelin, or the long jump. All of these he recognizes as resulting from the body building up a certain kind of muscular tension and then a physical launching. And he noted, not uninteresting, I don't think, actually, this, that many popular late 20th century and now early 21st century sports or physical, you know, very physical pastimes don't exactly involve that anymore. They involve what I think he calls inserting the body into an existing wave. And he includes surfing and skydiving and so on in these sorts of sports in which you find the wave and you insert the body into it. And I think there is a certain sort of bridge in the experience of the skater to that gives rise to the apparent sort of mesmerizing appearance of effortlessness on the part of a skater once they are moving, where it seems as if the slightest inflection adds enormous momentum to the existing movement. I think I'll end my remarks there. I'd be very happy to respond to questions after maybe a minute. Thank you very much. Oh, I've got something else for you. Perhaps if we just turn off these, if we turn off the projectors.
Want the lights up?
Yes, please. Don't know where we do that. I don't know how unusual this is at the AA, but I've got a small piece of poetry to read to you. This is Land, is it too soon? Oh no, we can do that. Great, thank you for turning those off. It occurred to me that it's not quite contemporary, but they're not that far off each other. There's an extraordinary section in a late work of Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, called The Prelude, which is in large part a highly autobiographical poem, in which he talks about the experience of skating at night out of doors. And I first encountered this over the telephone when a friend of mine recommended it to me, and in the middle of a party said that she would read it to me over the telephone, and I heard this voice saying, "Quiet everybody, I'm reading The Prelude." And it is one of the most exciting pieces of poetic writing that I'm aware of. I won't attempt to read the whole section to you, but maybe just a short half of it. The thing is, you see, it touches on the extreme physicality and materiality and body aspect of this experience of skating in a way that seems counter to Raeburn's painting, so effortless in its resolution. But it arrives at a complete moment of stillness in the end. And if you can indulge me or whatever, I'll just treat you to this. The scene has been set. It's after sunset. And the writer is skating with a whole gang of people into the darkness, probably in the Lake District, on a starry night in the middle of the winter. And they're all yelling and calling to each other, and it's an incredible racket. Okay, I don't know if I can get the pacing right of this. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle. With the din, meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud. The leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. Not seldom from the uproar I retired into a silent bay, or sportively glanced sideway, leaving the tumultuous throng to cut across the image of a star that gleamed upon the ice. And oftentimes, when we had given our bodies to the wind, and all the shadowy banks on either side came sweeping through the darkness, spinning still the rapid line of motion, then at once have I, reclining back upon my heels, stopped short. Yet still the solitary cliffs wheeled by me, as if the earth had rolled with visible motion her diurnal round. Behind me did they stretch in solemn train, feebler and feebler, and I stood and watched till all was tranquil as a dreamless sleep. Isn't that wonderful? You know that experience when you're sitting on the train, gazing out of the window, and you pull into a station and the train stops and you get this strange elastic feeling of the muscles of the retina, that there's a slight sort of stretch to the view out of the window. That's what he's describing, as things skating, stopping, and yet still feeling that the cliffs are moving by. So in the end, I think there is a resolution to that Wordsworthian experience, which reaches a certain sort of parallel to the Raeburn painting. Anyway, we will leave it at that. But if there are any questions, I'd be delighted to do my best to respond. Brian.
At Walker's foot, there appears to be a circle. At least it read to me like an ellipse, as if there was a circle at his foot. It occurred to me that perhaps he'd actually gone round in a circle, although it looks rather small to have gone round in such a circle. And I didn't notice, I wonder if you noticed that, or whether you felt it was significantly placed there, because it's very noticeable.
I didn't, I'm pretty sure it's not intended as to be that he's in the process of a pirouette. I think if it's not too sort of boring to put it this way, I think technically I did in the end take Stuart Morgan's advice, too late sadly for him to ever see the result, but of making a skating film. And it was of a pirouette skater. And if you observe the body of a skater pirouetting, the body has to go through a set of positions in order to build up that rotational momentum. And in fact, if you, in this process of choosing a moment, a certain sort of moment, at most stages through that building up of momentum, actually, there's an unbelievable ungainliness about the appearance of the figure. It's very extraordinary. Usually one leg goes straight out in front, and then there's a sort of extension of arms and a sort of bunching up as it builds up. But so I haven't followed that thought. Whether it relates to an observed surface or not, where a pirouette might have taken place, I don't know. Or whether it might simply be a formal device on Raeburn's part to locate the foot. More likely that.
I wondered if it was the trace of simply skating in a circle, because circularity means the way something about the way that you're approaching the right-hand edge of the canvas. And yet, actually, I can't completely convince myself that he's simply in parallel transit the way that a Muybridge would be. So therefore, I wondered if actually there's an elliptical movement implied.
Yes. I'll apply my eye to that. I'm so, I suppose, a bit preoccupied with the notion of the parallel passing that I hadn't consciously examined that possibility, but I'll have certainly reflect upon it. I think possibly what matters in this, I mean, that's a very interesting thought, the notion of something coming back, rather than simply appearing stage left and disappearing stage right, but something continuously appearing, recurring.
I wonder if I could comment as a skater. I don't know how many other people in the room are skaters, but I was brought up on skates in the Fens. Used to skate to school. When this picture was painted, skates were, as you could see, strapped onto the foot on a wooden board and were quite long, flat blades. Figure skating, which develops much later, has a curved blade with teeth at the front in a boot which completely locks your ankle to it, which allows you to do things such as pirouetting or turning in a small circle, which you can't do on old skates. When I was a child, there was a competition in the Fens every year, long distance skating from Cambridge to Ely across the Fens, known as the Fen Run. And it gets to your issue of kinetics and effort and movement, which I think is something we would perhaps unravel more and more, both through painting, photography, film, and so-called kinetic art, because there are many sort of stages. But just in response to that sense of effort and movement, it was notable that the winners of the Fen Run, certainly every year when I was running it, were not strong, energetic young men with the latest skates. They were always elderly men, rather fragile, with old Fen skates.
Oh.
And when you saw them skating, there was almost no sense of movement. And the position they took was similar to that, but instead of this, it was this. It's all about central gravity. And they appeared almost not to move at all, and yet their movement was tremendously fast and tremendously efficient. So they expended almost no energy, whereas the young were rushing along and pushing and scrabbling. And if you see a modern speed skater, there's tremendous sort of energy.
Yes.
But these people knew a different way of skating, partly because of the technology of the skates they were using, but also to a different idea about what movement through space was about.
Yes. That's very interesting.
This image is very much from a period when that style of skating would have been both appropriate to a gentleman skating, but also technically possible. It wouldn't have been technically possible for him to pirouette on those skates. Sorry, that was...
Yes. No, very... I appreciate that enormously. No, I do appreciate that, because one knows if you examine a little bit at the etiquette of skating at the time, towards the end of the 19th century towards the end of the 18th century when this picture was painted. The etiquette of the Edinburgh Skating Club was enormous and profound. It was an extremely exclusive kind of and extremely demanding commitment. And exercises are described, extraordinarily, rather flamboyant exercises of people skating across the ice, as I said might mention this, with bows and arrows, and skating towards each other in these sorts of positions. And But there is an iconography, even in that, towards the iconography of classical sculpture. And so the combination, there is a combination of the glide on the one foot with the extended leg and the raised arm, which comes directly from Roman representations of the god Mercury, you see. So these are quite intended associations and references on the part of the practitioners of skating. So you might say that Raeburn had toned it down a little bit, But it's also true, if you look at Raeburn's extraordinary body of work as a portrait painter at the height of the Scottish Enlightenment, with a remarkable range of subjects in which he is recording an extraordinarily dynamic intellectual, economic, manufacturing, cultural moment, or the participants in that, or some participants in that moment, that this little painting, this big, it's unlike any of his other paintings. Almost all of them are quite stunning and adventurous in their ways, but not departing from a certain known convention of representation. And this painting, I think, you don't find him, as it were, exploring the potential of this kind of definition of the body elsewhere at all. And yet throughout it all, you see, for me, the reason that it continues to impress is that I experience it as as an object in the contemporary world. I don't experience it, and I feel this way about all of the works that I'm going to talk about in the next few weeks, is that regardless of the date of their production, I don't have an interest in them as historical objects. I have an interest in their capacity to announce themselves and become completely a part of the present in my experience. I don't see that painting that we've been talking about this afternoon I don't experience it as an antique object, as an object interesting because of its historical context. I see it as a completely modern work, as a part of my scene, if you like, at the moment, and will happily, place it next to something made yesterday. Now, I don't know if you know the work of one of the most outstanding painters of his generation, I think, Gary Hume, who I first knew as a student when I taught for a few years at Goldsmiths in the late 80s and 90s. But Gary is quite a celebrated painter now, I hope, one might say. He represented Britain at the Venice Biennale about 6 years ago. And, Gary stands there as a highly sort of contemporary figure with an extraordinary vocabulary of painting, which is intensely contemporary, really, and also in its manufacture. But he says, I'm a caveman, I'm an ancient Egyptian. He thinks of painting as something intensely historically present, as something of having real depth in terms of the accumulation of human experience. But he brings that sense of time and of the persistence of painting completely into the moment, into today, and sort of in a sort of counter way. I think that is what certain paintings themselves do. They bring themselves into the present. They don't remain bound historically. Some do. Mm.
and somehow the diagonal has been representative of the movement. In that one, in skating, the horizon line just sort of cuts through the middle,
Yes.
but then
Yeah.
he's poised sort of like a clock.
Yes. Yes.
And that can either be, as you mentioned about rotation, it actually is a rotation about the middle in that way. So one can actually look at the painting in terms of its geometry. And on the one hand, there's this the fact that skating actually is the actual painting itself.
Yes.
Where you can just look at it as shapes on figures.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, I agree with you about the formal divisions of the work. There is, we could say a kind of, if you imagine the skater even out of the picture, there is a scene of a certain sort of gravity. It's not too far-fetched to say it's reminiscent of some of those late monochromatic Rothko paintings that are cold and chilly. And somebody who was the other day, it wasn't you, Hugo, somebody was talking to me about the horizon in certain Goya paintings where there's a certain sort of line and then a rather terrible feeling of nothing sort of above or beyond it. And that, for me, isn't absent in the Raeburn painting. This sense of the curious combination of something elating about it, but also a certain sort of gravitas about it. And partly, I think, it's to do with that notion of the representation of a landscape, which is also completely constructed in the studio. It's not a plein air painting at all. It's really a complete studio painting. But I think the gravitas is also to do with the sense that the represented body pays no attention to the presence of the viewer. In the almost contemporary painting of a skater coming towards the viewer, there's that often present aspect of the portrait conveying an awareness on the part of the sitter to the notion of an imaginary future viewer. And the modest painting of Raeburn's, I think, carries none of that. There may be a certain vanity in it, in its treatment of the, subject, satisfying something in the treatment of the subject, but I also think there's an affecting kind of disconnecting between the simply this notion of the subject paying no attention to the presence of the viewer. And that, I think, locates the viewer in a very particular sort of way in relation to the painting, not only formally, but in terms of sense of identification or recognition or whatever, a certain sort of psychological dimension. And we might see that next week in examining Jeff Wall's restoration, because a number of figures appear in the photograph who appear to be restoring the great panorama, who were in a seeming, well, often regarded or described as seeming to be in a state of reverie, which is at once a certain sort of interiorized kind of sense around the represented figure. So although there's not an intended set of associations to pass through this little series, I think there will be occasional recurrences of that kind of thing. 'Cause something I'd like at least to come out of the series is for us to have had a conversation about the experience of looking at painting, and that involves us examining our own sense of relationship, not just an optical sense of looking or viewing, but actually the sort of lived relationship of the body in relation to the painting.
Any other points that anyone would like to raise? We shouldn't go on too much longer. But,
I'd like to go back to the circularity. Despite what you've got, I mean, Well, actually, I'm not sure what pirouette is. I simply mean going slowly in a circle. Now, what intrigues me is that the body of water was a previously moving body. It is now still. We know that it is absolutely horizontal. It's a measure of horizontality. This body is then identified with the flatness of the canvas in the way that you've scratched, pointed to scratchings. At the same time, there's some haziness about the horizon line, which is that strange effect sometimes of laying a roll of white paper in a studio. Photographers often use it, where you can see that there's a foreground, and then somehow the floor just disappears and it becomes a white. And somehow that's happened on the lake because of the haziness. And so there's some sense of great depth, and yet at the same time he's caught in absolute profile, apart from small motions such as the movement of the hat, rather like a Grecian figure on an urn. And the great poem of Stillness is Keats' ode on a Grecian urn, where it's a celebration of stillness. And on an urn you would turn it, and the figures would go around as a kind of panorama or a diorama from around. In this case, I just have the feeling that the depths of the lake imply some coming and going like that. He's not simply going past you. It's not a Degas where he's, snap, snap. Somehow there is some containedness in the completion, the fulfillment of a circular movement, which is embodied in his profile.
Well, that is an interesting point. I think, well, two thoughts I would have actually to be clear of my own sort of sense of this. One is to do with skating, which is knowing that when I observe skaters in contained rinks or out of doors on ponds or lakes, their tendency is to go round and round because you more or less have to as a collective activity. I take a great deal of pleasure, even though I can't skate, of watching skating. And if you go to the Courtauld Institute, it's probably still there now, their wintertime skating rink at Somerset House. Of course, everybody goes round and everybody goes in the same direction, because otherwise it would be a catastrophe and nobody would get anywhere. There is this other thing that I think Hugo was touching on, which is this notion of distance skating, the sort of thing that still happens in Holland when it's cold enough, the Utrecht canal skating, in which people are skating along canals for great distances, between one town and another, those sorts of much more linear trajectories. Second thought is that Raeburn died about 15 years before Daguerre perfected the fixing of photographic images, so Raeburn would never have seen a fixed photographic image, but I find it hard to imagine that he wouldn't have been aware of the preceding optical mechanisms and entertainments that already existed, including spinning optical devices in which something would appear to move, those little cylinders with vertical slots, and that you would spin and look through the flickering slots and appear to see a horse galloping or something like that. And I do detect a certain sort of proto-photographic aspect to Raeburn's painting. And it is true that his painting rooms in York Place, I think it is, in Edinburgh, were custom made by him with windows that went up beyond the ceiling line to admit steeper falls of light, and the construction of particular shutters and louvers and so on to control the fall of light onto his sitters. So he was clearly keenly aware of the studio being a sort of light box camera almost like space into which the controlled light would fall. But yes, I can also imagine a certain kind of awareness of some of those optical devices which had a particular kind of rotational aspect to them, quite apart from skating in this way as a manner of skating. But I think in the end, what I find inexhaustible about the painting is something other than skating. It's something to do with whatever whether this is a sort of passing that's parallel to me or one that is a part of a circularity. It's in the end, it's not skating. It's this being in transit. You know, it's this extraordinarily affecting representation of a human that's always passing, always in the process of passing, always in this certain sort of condition of transit, which is, I think, quite different to those photographs we were looking at of skaters, you know, who are literally in the middle of an energetic movement which is fixed. It's another potential of painting, I think, which pertains not only to the representation of moving bodies, but emerges out of completely other subjects, including completely non-representational subjects. There is this stilling, which I know Brian shares an interest in, which we might get a bit further with in the coming weeks. Shall we call it a day there?
I think so, yes. I think there's a large number of issues there which I'm sure will come up in the coming weeks, even if you're not intending them to be thematic, because you've touched on a huge range of quite different ways of thinking about looking at images. And I think that will come up again and again, and by the end of the debates we'll all be looking much more carefully at images. But thank you very much.
I might incidentally just let you know, I suggested the possibility of this being a series of 6 lectures. Depending how the sort of thinking goes, I might contain it within just 4 weeks. And so I thought I'd better say that was a possibility right now, rather than in 4 weeks' time saying I'm not going to do any more. Because it's an intended thought to not overextend the commentary, but to actually try to be very, very particular each week. But anyway, the future definitely holds Jeff Wall and what he thought of as the demise of the ruins of painting, which we'll be talking about a little next week, and other media. And following that will be the great cycle of frescoes by Piero della Francesca in Arezzo. And I'll be discussing that enormous architecturally located work of great complexity in relation to the work of the contemporary artist Yannis Kounelis. And just as a sort of taster, 2 years ago, Yannis Kounelis represented a work that he first made in Italy in the 1970s, in which he stabled 12 originally, on that occasion 11 horses in the ground floor of the Whitechapel Art Gallery. And when I spoke to him about the work on that day, he said, it's all to do with fresco. So how 12 live horses in the Whitechapel Art Gallery might relate to Piero della Francesca's fresco will be the subject of that day. And always want to recommend an exhibition, very rare opportunity to see a very important exhibition, major exhibition of Yannis Kounelis at Modern Art Oxford, which is there right now. So there we are, just a hint of things to come. Thank you very much for coming.